This is a sort of a second in a series of leadership sessions aimed at thinking about the return to community, the return to in-person community, and thinking through together some of the impact. I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Ron Wolfson here from the States, and he's certainly somebody who I have followed for a while and has been an inspiring part of my learning around Jewish organizing and what it means to be engaged and think about Jewish organizing, particularly Relational Judaism and the Handbook have been two books that have been really massive and that I use a lot. And I see a few people here who've done organizing courses with Masorti. So I really am excited for this opportunity to sort of think together about what lies ahead for us. Also, I'm just really happy to see everybody here. Thank you. I want to welcome Rabbi Jonathan, Senior Rabbi of the movement, who is going to introduce the session and give a few thoughts on where we're at in the UK, and then we will pass over to Dr. Ron. So thank you so much. Rabbi Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to everybody. And Dr. Wolfson, it's a real treat and it's an honor for us that you've joined us, and we're looking forward to learning from you and to hearing your many ideas and your broad experience. I remember too when you've been in our home and at our community, and I remember, I hope I've got this right, you saying you like to get there early and see what kind of signage and posters they're out. So you haven't been able to do this in person, but I imagine you've done it on Zoom. Just so that for the context, looking at your bio, you're professor of education at the American Jewish University and the president of the Kripke Institute, but you said your favorite title is, and you're holding the baby, to be called Zayda. And that really, that says it about you, that you're a person who really, it's the relationships that count. And I remember that you said when you spoke in my community last time, it's not just your programming, it's the relationships you build through them. It's the personal. So looking forwards very much. I'm just going to say a couple of words about where we are in terms of lockdown. And that's very vague because on two fronts, at least, there is such a spread of feeling. There are people who can't wait to get together, to have these bigger numbers, to celebrate, to be able to have real food, togetherness, significant numbers of people, and joy. And there are other people, somebody said to me yesterday, I'm not yet ready to come to anything, because they've been really shielding and sheltering. And so whatever approach we have, we need to be aware that there are people who, perhaps for very good medical reasons and personal reasons, are in completely different places. And we have somehow to reach all of them and help a journey forward from them both. And that's kind of on the sort of physical and practical level. On the emotional level, I'm also aware that there are people who've been looking after children and teenagers who've been cooped up and just cannot wait to get their lives in action and moving forwards again. There've been a kind of forced stasis of that movement forward, and they're excited about it. And there are other people in whose circles there's been a lot of grief. They've lost a loved one, or they've been close to family who've lost maybe more than one loved one. And they're in a very, very different emotional place. And the journey forward feels very, very different. And it's how one also gives messages that embrace the need for joy and are heartfelt in the awareness of sorrow. And those are some of the dilemmas that I'm very conscious of, and I think we're all conscious of as we move out of lockdown. So, Dr. Wolfson, looking forward very much to hearing your thoughts. And I think there'll be a chance if people direct questions to Rachel in the chat, she will then put them forward and facilitate them later. Thank you.
Oh, Rabbi Jonathan, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I do remember being in your lovely flat, having a wonderful Shabbat together. And I've had a number of wonderful visits in London. And I thank all of you for joining us tonight. It's a great introduction because I should tell you right off the bat that my wife and I, Susie, and I spent nearly 8 months last year at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, where Susie received a life-saving kidney transplant. And I donated one of my kidneys to a stranger on her behalf a week later. Unfortunately, 2 days after Susie's transplant, she had a major complication and required a second surgery that really set her back. And then the pandemic hit. So we were locked down there for nearly 8 months. And I tell you what we've learned. We've learned during that time that it's all about relationships. And we were sustained by so many family and friends who were there with us. Fast forward, Susie's doing well now. It took about a year, but she is doing well. We did get fully vaccinated, and yet, I don't know if it's really had the kind of publicity over there as it has not had over here, but Susie takes these very powerful immunosuppressant drugs to prevent her antibodies from attacking her new kidney. She's what's called immunocompromised. And last week, we actually tested her blood, and though she's fully vaccinated, she has 0.02 antibodies from the vaccines. So Rabbi Wittenberg, you're absolutely correct. There are going to be people in our community that, regardless of what we do as a general community, are going to be very hesitant to come back into large groups. However, we have to keep our tikva, our hope, alive. And I do believe we will be there within the next number of months. And the question is always, what are we going to face? What are we going to do as synagogue communities, as spiritual communities? And during all that time in Rochester, Minnesota, I gave quite a bit of thought to this and spoke to many, many, many synagogue leaders all over North America and around the world. And here's what I concluded. I'll start with a famous aphorism attributed to your former Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who it is said to, that he has said to his colleagues Stalin and Roosevelt at the famous Yalta Conference after World War II, never let a good crisis go to waste. Now, whether he really said it or it was said that he said it, I think it's a good opening to our conversation this evening. You know, the word crisis, the Hebrew word for crisis is mashber. And mashber not only means crisis. In the Torah, it's referred to as the birth stool. We see it several times in Torah. It really refers to the cervical opening. So in other words, crisis is equated with the actual moment of birth. So what will be new coming out of the pandemic in our communities? That, I think, is the big question for us to discuss. Two caveats before I give you what I call my 9 suggestions for where we'll be. I'm fully aware that there are significant differences between religious life over here in the United States and for you folks in the UK. I'm very aware that there are different gradations of Jewish observance in our communities. I want us to focus on the principles of my points, not the practices. Because if we leave with the principles in mind, you will be able to apply them to your own setting in your own community. The second caveat is this. I've done a lot of work in synagogue transformation for many, many years. Some of you might know I did a major project called Synagogue 2000, Synagogue 3000, between 1995 and 2015. With my colleague, Professor Larry Hoffman at Hebrew Union College. And when we talked about synagogue change among synagogue leaders, we often got eye rolls, and we realized how difficult it is to change congregational life. I used to joke at conferences that above the Aron HaKodesh in many congregations I visited, and I've visited hundreds over the years, There's usually a Hebrew phrase, da lifnei miata omed, know before whom you stand, referring to God, of course. But I would joke at the conference, it shouldn't be that over the arc of a congregation. It should say, but we've always done it that way. Now, guess what? On a dime, on a pence, on a 10 pence, we transitioned everything we do in synagogue life onto the Zoom, onto the YouTube, onto the Facebook, literally overnight. It is one of the great miracles in my entire career that synagogues were able to do that. I know some of you might have met in backyards and so on when the weather was good, but just think about it for a minute. There was this confluence of synagogues' ability to take our worship services, our Torah study, our programming, and put them online, and then our congregants learning about Zoom. I mean, how many of you knew about Zoom before the pandemic hit? Can I just see hands? 2 or 3. Well, as our congregants learned about how to manage the technology, we had this confluence. So I'm sure it's true over there too. We heard reports of more people attending worship services, more people doing Torah study, more people engaged in synagogue life than ever before. And it's quite an irony. And it's one of the things we're going to have to think about as we move forward. But don't tell me synagogues can't change. We proved it. Here are my 9 points very briefly. Number 1, synagogues will continue to embrace the technology. Absolutely. In my mind, there is no going back. And most rabbis I've spoken to, synagogue leaders I've spoken to, they understand that we're going to have to continue what's now called over here multi-access venues for people to access the things we do. Number 2, some synagogues will partner and some communities will consolidate. One striking realization through the pandemic that is absolutely irrefutable is the learning that synagogues are not buildings. We've been able to sustain our communities without a physical structure. When the doors were locked and all of our gathering moved online, some people began to ask, do we need all this infrastructure? Certainly over here, there are billions of dollars tied up in real estate. And some people are asking that question, do we need it all? And some mergers are beginning to happen. Here in Los Angeles, a large Reform congregation absorbed, consolidated with a medium-sized Reform congregation. And I think we'll see more of that on this side of the pond. I don't know about you. The third point, synagogues will develop new models of engaging members. You know, I've taught before that the 20th century model of engagement were to get people involved in the congregation on committees, to volunteer. Over here, before the pandemic, everybody was so busy with their lives that many people you would ask to volunteer would demur, they wouldn't do it. Now, some of us realize another reason why they wouldn't do it, because in many congregations, if you were asked to volunteer for a committee, you'd be made the chair of the committee overnight. And it would be a life sentence. You would never get off the committee. So the question is, how do we engage people differently? And I think it will be with short-term commitments, with a clear purpose, with on-ramps and off-ramps to synagogue volunteerism. Here's my 4th point. Synagogues must continue to grow larger by being smaller. Now, a key strategy of relational Judaism is to deepen the engagement with our people on 3 tiers. The first tier is between each person we reach and the Jewish experience, and we do a good job at that. The second tier is between our clergy, staff, and lay leadership, with each member of the community. I often say the greatest compliment clergy receive is when someone says, Rabbi Jonathan, he's my rabbi. My indicates a wonderful relationship has been established. And the third tier, perhaps the most important, is between the members themselves. So there'll be a group of friends with you in good times and in difficult times, as we've just experienced. These peer-to-peer relationships are often built by developing small groups. And the question is, are you a synagogue with some small groups, or are you a synagogue of small groups? Here's my fifth point. Synagogues and other Jewish communal institutions are going to have to ramp up our mental and physical health efforts. Now, I know many of your congregations have done this. You've been there for people who have been depressed, who have lost a job, who have needed some support financially or otherwise. And just as it took us some time after the financial collapse in 2008, the devastating effects of this pandemic will be long haul, as they call it. I think there'll be a COVID long haul that we need to pay attention to. So at the shul I attend, Valley Beth Shalom, a conservative synagogue in Los Angeles, we have a fully staffed, lay-led counseling center that has a separate entrance into the building for privacy purposes, led by members of the congregation who are certified therapists and counselors. There's a day school, a Jewish day school here in Los Angeles, a large day school that has a director of wellness on the faculty to work with students and their families to make sure they are mentally and physically well. We're going to see more of that. Number 6, membership models will continue to evolve. Now, this may be a bit controversial, but I like to tell the truth. The move to synagogue programming online begs the question, why should I pay dues or financial contributions when I can now pray and study with some of the greatest synagogues anywhere in the world? I can learn from some of the most charismatic rabbis and teachers in the world at no cost, for free. That begs the question, what's the value offer of membership in a synagogue post-pandemic? Well, it's the same for me as it was before the pandemic. A synagogue must be an in-person sacred community of relationships leading me to a Judaism that provides 4 things: a path to meaning, what's it all about? Purpose, what am I to do with my divinely inspired spiritual gifts and talents and passions? 3, belonging, a community that cares about me and will be there for me. And the 4th point, blessing, a place to celebrate the many moments in my life. Here's my 7th point. Worship services will continue to be streamlined. The move to online prayer required us to cut down the amount of time because of the Zoom fatigue. People would not stay on for more than 90 minutes mostly. Now, while some Orthodox synagogues continued their regular practice, I even had one modern Orthodox rabbi here in Los Angeles admit to me that his Yom Kippur is no longer going to be the same. Kind of like a Haskama minyan, it's going to be shorter. Here's my 8th point. We're going to see, and we've already begun to see it over here, the emergence of national and perhaps international congregations. Live streaming obliterated the geographical constraints of local congregations. When anyone in the world could access most synagogues offering programming and even membership to people thousands of miles away, some forward-leaning synagogues here in the United States grabbed onto this opportunity. I can mention Central Synagogue in New York, and I can mention here in Los Angeles, ICAR, led by Rabbi Sharon Brous, which has gained 200 members during the pandemic. They're called ICAR members from afar. ICAR from afar. And I think we'll see more congregations eager to do this. And my 9th point, I believe in the final analysis, virtual Judaism is interesting, thank God we had it, but it's a substitute for in-person community. And I dream, now circling back to our first point, I dream with all the obstacles and all the caveats of the time when we can gather together in large numbers in our communities to both remember what we've lost, to thank all of those who got us through the pandemic, and to transition, as we're taught in Psalm 30, from mourning to dancing. Matt Glenn knows that I've been working on a opportunity to do this, which I call the Hanukkah homecoming weekend. And I can tell you more about it later, but I have this dream that by Hanukkah time coming up, we'll be able to do that kind of in-person gathering. So those are my 9 points, and lovely to hear your questions and comments.
I'm happy for people to just, if people want to ask a question, either raise a virtual hand or a physical hand, and we'll come to you. You don't need to go through the chat, I don't think.
While we're waiting for questions coming in, can I just ask you to enlarge on, I think it was your second or third point, which was the new model of engaging with members. Can you say a little bit more about what you had in mind there?
Yes, I can, Rabbi. Look, there are, in most congregations, what I would call the regulars, the people who like to daven, the people who come to Torah study, the people that are interested in our social justice work or other avenues of what we do. Over here in the United States, a number of people join synagogues basically when they want their children to have a Jewish education. You know, here, unlike there, about 85% or so of children who get a Jewish education do not get it in a day school. They get it in a synagogue supplemental school. One wag once said the greatest motivator for synagogue membership is when a couple or a person gives birth to a 7-year-old child. So now we want to get our kids a Jewish education. And often those same families kind of disappear when the youngest child is bar bat mitzvah or off to college or university. So the question is, how do we engage people more deeply, Rabbi, when we do have them? I think it's a two-pronged issue. On the one hand, how do we deepen engagement with the people who are already affiliating with our communities? And on the other hand, how do we recruit new members? So I'm first concerned about deepening the relationships of the people we already have connected to us. And that was my point. I think we could do a much better job in connecting them to our leaders and making sure that every person who affiliates with our congregations feels a personal connection to the rabbi, a cantor, an educator, a teacher, an executive director, a lay person in leadership in the community, so they feel like they have been seen and heard. You know, many synagogues spend a lot of time broadcasting what their programs are. And we should spend more time listening to our people. So one way to do this is by ensuring that every adult member, certainly of the community, is engaged in some significant way with someone else, that we've heard their story. I often say, you know, the watchword of the Jewish community, the Jewish people, is not Daber Yisrael, it's Shema Yisrael. It's listening to our people. So some synagogues have listening campaigns. Some synagogues develop small groups based on affinity, things you like to do together, or geography. What neighborhood do you live in? We can gather for a Havdalah together in the neighborhood, God willing soon. Or demography, stage of life. So synagogues are usually pretty good with families, but at least over here, often the elders are kind of shunted to the side. So how do we engage that senior community and help them age well? And the other is kind of the the idea of finding some passion, some interest that we can link people to. All of that, Rabbi, is to deepen engagement with the people we already have. That's what this Relational Judaism Handbook is all about, to help people develop an engagement campaign to deepen the relationship, not just with the representative of the synagogue, but with each other. So they have a community of friends who will be there with them during life's journey.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Rabbi Joel, and then Rabbi Ollie has a question.
Sure.
Oh, hi, thanks a lot. So in Israel, there's a kind of opposite trend, which is that communities have fragmented into small groups of people who daven together and have realized they don't need a building and a rabbi and all that stuff. They need their mates to come and gather around. And you know, the average size of a minyan in certain parts of Israel is 12, 15 people, because then you get genuine participation, and it's the opposite of consolidation. It's it's a very kind of vibrant creation of subgroups, which don't then feel that they need to be connected to large communities. And I think the same has happened. I think there's something that's happened in the same direction during COVID in the UK. People have started learning together in small groups. People have started, instead of gathering together in extended family units for Pesach, people found themselves doing it on their own for the first time, which for some people, this was a revelation. You know, I've always had Seder run by my father-in-law, and now I did it myself, and it was better. It was better because I actually articulated my version of Judaism that was decentralized as opposed to centralized. And I wonder why the American model is so different from the Israeli model. Why is the American model, because of moving through technology, has moved to a decentralized, local model of Judaism, where effectively you could have, Ikar running davening for the West Coast, and it would be great because Ikar does great davening. So let's get everyone to daven at Ikar. Whereas in Israel, it's the opposite. They're saying, let's break it down into smaller and smaller shchunot, where everyone does their own minyan. Why has America gone one way and Israel the other way?
It's a great question. I'm not sure what the answer is. I can tell you that that there is a part of that happening here on this side of the pond, as we say, especially among younger Jews. There's a real strong, it's often called DIY, do-it-yourself Judaism that's emerging. And that's wonderful. And it's wonderful that small groups are gathering. It's a challenge to our existing institutions. I think that's my point, that rather than ignore this trend, we ought to capitalize on it by offering the support that these small groups often need. So over here, there's not as much, I think, inclination to do small minyanim on your own in small groups. Perhaps in the Orthodox world there are, but I haven't seen that in the conservative world here. What I've seen is that communities are davening together online. They do value being together in community. Some really interesting ways have developed to do what I would call the virtual lobby and the Oneg Shabbat after the davening, by opening up Zoom rooms early and staying a little bit later to have that kind of interaction that we do when we're in person. I don't know what we're going to do about Shabbat kisses and hugs. I think we're going to have a challenge with that. I don't know what we're going to do about food. I hope at some point we can return to eating together. But I don't see that happening, at least here. And I would hope that, some question I do get often is, how do you ensure these small groups to stay connected to the larger community? Well, that's why the larger community should support the development of small groups with leaders who are community oriented and do see it as we're not going to be atomized, just our own little minion here. There's a greater value in being together with a larger community. I hope certainly that's how we continue to grow.
Rabbi Oliver, you have a question.
Hi, Rabbi Oliver.
Hi, sorry, I'm not using my video this evening. We learned together at Ziegler in Los Angeles. It's lovely to see your face again.
Thank you, Oliver. Good to see you.
Lovely, lovely. I just wondered if there was a particular version that I think you've started to speak to it, but just a particular version that you have in your mind about the difference between online and in-person activities and what's suited to what. Because I agree with you 100%, we're not going back to where we were. But I also agree with you, there are some things that people are craving to do in person. Do you have a vision of how those break down, what we will do in person going forward and what we will continue to do online going forward, and what the crucial differences are?
A great question, Rabbi. You know, the biggest problem with the Zoom davening is we can't sing together. I think people are eager not just to see each other. We've been able to see each other online in these little boxes, but we have not been able to daven together. We have not been able to sing together. It's impossible with the technology, as far as I know. So I think there will be a great desire to, I get goosebumps thinking about it, to be in a room again with a group of people lifting their voices. Now, we might be masked. We might very well still be masked for a while until, I think, at least over here, they're saying until all the children are inoculated. You know, the virus will not be completely subsided. But I think that that's going to be one big difference, Rabbi. But I do think that some people have said the advantages of Zoom in Torah study is that I get to see each other differently in the small groups. Some people have even said that about davening. You know, in the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services were live streamed last year. Many people said they appreciated being able to see the faces of the clergy more clearly than sitting rows and rows in the back in some of these larger sanctuaries. Now the rabbis and cantors had to suddenly become television personalities. And for some of them, it was kind of intimidating, but they did a beautiful job from the ones that I watched. So I think that there are some advantages to, come on, so let's be honest. Some people love being in their pajamas during Torah study, you know. Here's another thing that's so interesting. I've had people, leaders of synagogues, say to me, you know what we're going to continue to do online? Committee meetings. Because the traffic is so bad in Los Angeles that I had a past president of the shul I attend, Valley Beth Shalom, say to me, I live in Santa Monica, if you know Los Angeles. Takes me an hour in traffic to get to Valley Beth Shalom and Encino in the San Fernando Valley. I'd have my hour and a half or 2 hours at the congregation and another hour to get home. Now I can do the committee work online and I don't have to deal with the traffic. I think we're going to see the business of synagogues continue to happen online because it's so much more convenient for people. And you can stay in your sweatpants.
Rabbi Zahavit.
Hi, Ron.
Hi, Rabbi.
I recognize a lot of what you say. I mean, for instance, for existing relationships, we've been able to sustain them and build them and do stuff online. But point 8 that you made, you were talking about Ikar from afar and picking up members who are geographically distant. So, for example, having run our conversion course for 15 years and always insisting that if you want to be in our conversion program, you've got to come to shul twice a weeknight for classes and on Friday night and Shabbat. we've now picked up a few people who have never stepped through the door of the shul, and it didn't matter during COVID because all the classes were on Zoom. But what do we do with all these people who feel themselves, you know, part of our community and have never and may never be able to cross the threshold? I honestly, it's a genuine question. What do we do with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I heard from a friend in Israel just last week. You know, they've lifted almost all restrictions. So people are coming back into person in their communities. And there's a backlash against continuing online. And it's not easy to do. You know, in my own university, American Jewish University, the staff was asked to come back into the office. And then there are a bunch of us that will not do that because of the issues that I raised earlier. And to do both simultaneously is very challenging. You know, my son-in-law works for Google. So Google has now created in their office spaces something called Campfire. It's a person sits like I'm sitting here, and then next to me, like I have right over my shoulder here, there's a monitor, and somebody who's working remotely will be in the monitor. And then the next space in the circle of the campfire is a real person. And then the next space is a monitor. And then the next space is a real person. Can you imagine that? Now, it's going to be a challenge to do both because it's different than just, you know, I mean, a lot of congregations here had live streaming of services. So people who were ill or could not attend would be able to watch it. But it was mostly one stationary camera in the back of a sanctuary onto the bema. Not like what we saw last High Holidays, where some synagogues transformed their sanctuaries into television studios with multiple cameras and, I mean, all kinds of things going on. So I think we'll be challenged, Rabbi. I think that it's a great question. I think we're going to be challenged to both continue to have the access for those people we've gained. And I'm not surprised you gained people in your conversion program. We run a big one here at American Jewish University that has gone global. There are people getting converted to Judaism from all over the world here in Los Angeles at our campus that will never be on our campus. So I think it's a challenge. I think it's going to be, you know, trying to figure it out as we come back together. But we shouldn't lose these people, is my point. We need to figure out a way to not only have them in our programming, but to invite them for one-on-one conversations with your teachers and your rabbis and your cantors. That, I think, is the missing piece that we have to keep focused on as we continue. There's no substitute for one-on-one conversations. That's true in person, and it's true on Zoom.
I just want to offer one more thought, actually. I was talking with somebody and I was remembering that a friend had done an Open University course. And I don't know if you have the Open University in the States, but it's existed for decades here as an alternative to traditional campus universities for people who couldn't, for circumstances or financial reasons, go. So they've always done remote learning, but a lot of their courses had like an in-person seminar, like maybe one at the beginning and one in the middle and one at the end. And so somehow they finagled it that you felt that you'd met the people on the course, even though you spent comparatively little time with them, because you met them at a few of the key moments, and they really, ensured that those were well-used times. So I guess, is that a fantasy that these remote members would get a really big, heavy-hitting Shabbaton, a couple of times a year, and the rest of the time they'd be wherever they are?
Well, I'll tell you one thing. To gather them together in person after they've made a relationship on Zoom will be like, I don't know if you were a kid, did you ever have a pen pal from another country or another city? And then you actually got to meet this person that you had been writing to? That's what it's going to feel like. It's like, oh my God, I finally can God willing, give you a hug and see you in person and share a meal. I just like coming back together in large numbers of people give me goosebumps. I think that so the lessons for me to take away from this part of the conversation is you can continue to build relationships online, and God willing, when we're back in person, be sure to capitalize on those relationships and bring those people together. And when you bring them together, here's my big caution to you, leaders of Masorti UK. Do not fall into the trap of just being with your regular friends. The biggest challenge I see in visiting, particularly conservative congregations, is that the regulars who like to sit with each other in your makom kavua, your established place in the sanctuary, which is a wonderful thing. I'm not saying don't do that. But if you only stick together and talk with the people you already know, then these new people that Rabbi just talked about will walk into your spaces. And if nobody welcomes them warmly, if nobody says, come and sit with me for kiddush lunch, then we're going to lose them. So we should revisit and reignite our welcoming and our Hachnasat Orchim projects to make sure that everyone feels welcome when we do come back in person. It's really important. This Hanukkah homecoming weekend of events that I hope will be a global experience, the focus is not membership recruitment. It's not bringing new people in as members. It's to say, look at what the value is of our community. Come and take a look. Come return, come on back. Those of you who are members, we can't wait to see you again. And for new people, come and see the value of community in person. And that's the idea. And it must be focused on relationship building.
Thank you. Thank you. Matt.
Hi, Matt.
Hi, Ron. Thanks for being with us.
Sure.
It's nice to see everybody as well. So my question, I'm looking around the room. So first of all, you've been very helpful, I think, the framework of the paradigm of being relational really helps me at least think through how to combine online with in person, because actually online and in person are two different ways of building relationships. And we've seen that it's possible to do it both ways, in different ways. And some people prefer one and some people prefer the other. And actually figuring out ways to build relationships using both, I think that's a good kind of paradigm switch for me. So you've solved one problem for me, at least in my mind. My question is one of capacity. And I'm looking around the room and seeing, leaders of communities of very different sizes. We've got leaders of New York London Synagogue here with 3,000 people, and we've got leaders of tiny chavarot of, 30 and 40 people. And the idea of being relational rather than programmatic, or instead of programmatic. So instead of, we naturally focus our time on program, right? On events and services and activities. And your suggestion, and it's one I believe in, is that we should think less about program and think more about relationship building with people, and how do we find ways of building relationships. But looking around the room at all the leaders of these communities, my first thought is, where do we find the time? In other words, we have to carry on running services. So where do we find the time to do the relationship building? That's what I would be thinking as a volunteer leader of a community, or a rabbi actually of a community. So my question for you is, what advice do you have for us on how do we find the time and how do we prioritize doing that?
So my first response, Matt, is there's nothing wrong with programs. We all do programs. We all do worship experiences. We all do study experiences. My advice is to build a small piece of your time together for relationship building. You can do it even on Zoom. Now, we didn't do it tonight, but if I said to Rachel, get us all in a breakout room with another person for 3 minutes or 5 minutes so that we could have a conversation, that would be an example of what I call relational moments, When I'm a guest scholar in a congregation, when I give my talk, I will make this point and I will say, let's experience it. And I've been in sanctuaries with 500 people, and I've been in sanctuaries with 50 people. And I've said, let's take 5 minutes, go meet someone in the sanctuary you don't know, or you don't know well. And let me give you a prompt for you to talk about. You know, it could be what keeps you up at night, or it could be what gets you up in the morning, or it could be, you know, how did you get here from where you were? Something that you can spend 5 minutes in all of our programs. We call it checking in. And it doesn't matter how big you are. It could be a small chavurah. It could be a congregation of 3,000 people. The goal is that people are seen and heard. That's the goal. And whatever size your community is, your leadership should take a list of your members and ask yourself the question, who knows this person? How is this person connected? Are they involved in some way? Have we reached out to them? I know many of you have made phone calls during COVID, and that's been terrific. You ought to continue that. Some congregations have made deliveries of Shabbat baskets and so on, or holiday baskets, you know. Why is it Chabad are the only ones giving out stuff? We ought to give out stuff. I think that it's really important.
Because they've got the time. They've got the time. That's why.
Why do they have the time?
Because they're not doing anything else, whereas we've all got full-time jobs.
That's right. Well, wait a second. The rabbis have no boards. They have no committees. They are completely dedicated to relationship building. They also know that they have to raise their own money, and fundraising is essentially friend raising. So they make those relationships and they make the time. So I know that many of you are very busy in your full-time jobs and you're volunteers. All I'm suggesting is that you spend, if you carved 1 hour out of your week to make phone calls to the people you're engaged with, it would make a huge difference. If you sent a handwritten note in the Real Post, it would make a huge difference. Susie and I were sitting in Rochester, Minnesota for those 7.5 months. You know what? We had all kinds of emails, hundreds of emails. We had lots of phone calls. Do you know what ended up on our bedstand? The handwritten get well cards that people sent to us in the real mail. Not the emails, not the phone calls. So that kind of personal touch is what I'm talking about. Yes, it takes time. Some larger congregations over here have hired rabbis or social workers or community organizers called engagement directors. Now that would only apply to your larger communities, but you know, like most things in synagogue congregational life, unless there's somebody in charge, it doesn't happen. So there are a variety of ways to make this happen. I'm just trying to point out how critical it is for keeping our engagement with our current members, and certainly when we welcome in new people.
Thank you. Rabbi Natasha, you had your hand. Are you still?
Hello. I did put my hand down, but I do think, because I wasn't quite sure how to make this a question. I think it's not very well formed in my head.
First of all, hi Natasha, nice to see you.
Hi Ron, it's lovely to see you, and maybe you'll be able to make sense of the question.
Hold on a second. This is the best rabbinic student I ever had in my whole career, right here, Rabbi Natasha.
So many lies.
I'm a truth teller. She's the best. It's so good to see you.
You're actually making me blush. That's not something that happens very often.
On the Zoom, she's blushing. I love it. Spotlight her. Make sure you spotlight her.
I wanted to ask you about how when we are doing things in person, I feel that it's much easier to read what kind of relationship someone wants. Is this someone who actually wants to be introduced to a big group? Or is this someone who just wants to have like a private conversation with me? Whereas doing things online, there's like so much of that is so much further away. And I know that some people really hate being put into a breakout room with another person to discuss something, and they'll turn their camera off and pretend that they're not there, and then the other person is like awkwardly waiting for them. And I was just wondering, you know, we're a year into using this medium, if you have any thoughts about how all of that sort of you know, introversion and sort of awkwardness is can be handled.
It's so interesting. I think, Rabbi, you were probably with me when we visited Saddleback Church, and we learned a lot from the megachurch world. And one of the things that these are evangelical Christians, and one of the things they do not do is call on people and say, please introduce yourself. They know that many people want to be anonymous as they're tiptoeing into congregational life. So I think we have to be very careful about our invitations. The best way I've seen this in person is when a rabbi will invite people, if they wish, to stand up and be introduced, but those who don't want to be are not put on the spot. I don't know what we do about the technology. And I too, you know, have students who would prefer not to be on video when I'm teaching, and I'm always wondering, what are they doing? Are they making dinner? Are they watching Doctor Who? What are they doing, you know, while I'm teaching? But I would say on balance, more people than not welcome the engagement and welcome the opportunity to meet somebody. It has to be contextualized. You have to tell people why we're doing this, because the value offer of a synagogue community, is relationship. You know, if not, I don't know what we are offering to people for their support. I really am nervous about the fact that so many people now really like being in their pajamas during Yom Kippur. They really like tuning into you know, these live streamed experiences. Some synagogues over here spent tens of thousands of dollars in producing these things. It's not my cup of tea, but I see the value for some. And so what are we going to offer people? It has to be a relational community. And by the way, Rabbi Natasha, as you know, if you ask the people in your community why they've stayed in the community all these years, it's because this is my second home. These are my friends. These are my people. This is my Rabbi Natasha. I'm telling you, the best single student I ever had in all my years at the Ziegler School of
I'm going to go off camera if you keep doing that, Ron.
Okay, do. We're almost done. We've got 4 more minutes.
I'd like to ask a question, Ron, just something that I'm thinking about, a bit cheeky, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm thinking about the people who've not been engaged this year. Yeah. The people who've fallen off, the people who we haven't seen, and perhaps we haven't even thought about the fact that we haven't seen them. And I'm thinking about what's like the pathway to sort of reintroduction into the community. And I think sometimes I've heard from lots of people, you know, that you'll call them and they say, well, I just don't want to be on Zoom. I don't want to be on Zoom. I'm not interested while it's on Zoom. And I think my anxiety is that, you know, if you haven't done that for a year, that are you just going to drop off and not sort of be back? And have you got any thoughts on how we sort of re-engage or work with those dormant members of the community who once were very involved?
Yeah, I think we have to do this reunion. This Hanukkah homecoming weekend idea came because I learned that in the churches in the South of the United States, They have an annual reunion called homecoming. Now, I don't know if you do this in the UK. Over here, colleges have homecoming weekends. You know, it's a football game and people are, you know, come back together. In my hometown of Omaha, Nebraska, one year, the community did a reunion. And you know what? 300 people showed up because they were eager to be back in relationship with each other. Susie and I traveled to Omaha to be part of that weekend. So I think you have to plan on inviting people back when we are in person. And that's why I hope all of your communities will sign up for this. You'll see stuff about it soon. And Matt and I have talked about this, that Masorti UK will, I hope, be partners with us. The idea is that on that weekend of Hanukkah, Shabbat Hanukkah, December 3rd to 5th, we'll offer opportunities to welcome those people back and to welcome new people to come take a look. And it ought to be celebratory, it ought to be memorable, it ought to be ritualized. And we ought to think about the different audiences we want to bring together and celebrate coming back together in person. I can't wait for that. And, you know, God willing, one of these days soon, I'll get over to visit you all again. I would love that because I think the food's gotten better in the UK. I mean, we actually were there. Susie and I took a world trip before we had the kidney transplant, and we spent 4 glorious days in your wonderful town. And the food got better. It really did.
Just before you finish, if we just get one more question in there, and Rabbi Joel.
Just to play devil's advocate. Oh, I'm on mute still.
No, you're not.
No, I'm all right. All right, good.
No, devil's advocate. Oh, we're out of time. Sorry.
No,
oh,
okay.
gee,
No, I mean, do we have to do this? Is it possible in the Masorti movement to create communities which are centered around, I don't know, like God or Torah or something like that, where people's primary commitment was to the activity, and the relationships were secondary. The relationships were what happened when you did the thing together, as opposed to the relationship being primary. So you served God or Torah, and the relationships that you came through that act of service.
Yes.
I think that was probably where I was pushing about the Orthodox communities. I've been grieving about not being Orthodox with lockdown, because in lockdown I just knew that my frum neighbors carried on davening, and they did it despite the fact that they weren't being served by relation. They were just doing it to serve God, and they just carried on doing the things that they were committed to. Whereas what you've described is a kind of, you know, it's all. I think you might be right. It might be necessary. I might have to be nice to people, but it would be nice if I didn't have to be nice to people, and people would carry on doing Jewish things anyway.
I think, Joel, I think that there are, so thank you for that question. In all seriousness, it's a great question. Look, in my book, Relational Judaism, I talk about 9 levels of relationship, and the number 1 relationship is with God. You know, I actually have 9 levels of relationship. I make it into kind of a Hanukkah, and the Shamash is our relationship with, it's Ben Adam Lamakom, right? That's the central relationship in Judaism. The problem is a lot of people get nervous about God. So I'm not concerned about the people who are in relationship with God. I am after the people who don't have it yet. I want to lead them to that point. And I don't want God to be the obstacle. So the way I'd handle it is by saying, what is your image of God? Tell me about the God you don't believe in. And you know what I get? I get an old man with a white beard on the throne in the heavens. I say, listen, I'm a disciple of Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig and Harold Schulweis, who taught me that godliness exists in every human being. And if we create a relational community where each of us treats each other as the B'Tselem Elohim we were created to be, and we can join together to be God's hands and feet and eyes and ears and heart and soul on this world, and we can join together in relational community to be God's agents, to be God's partner, then they might find a way to God and want to daven to something beyond themselves. And that's my concern. God bless you all for the work you do. I know the rabbis and the leaders of and cantors and the leaders, the educators of congregations are exhausted at the end of this unbelievable year. Kol hakavod to you, all of you leaders of Masorti UK, for keeping us alive in our congregations during a remarkable, remarkable year. And God bless you as you continue to do this work. Never forget, your work in building sacred community is itself a godly act. And God will bless you for it, as do I.
Thank you for being with us. A huge thank you. And also refuah shlema to Susie, and that we should soon gather in the numbers for God and one another.